Everyone for showing up. Really nice. As you can see on your screen right now, this will be recorded. So please, if you want to remain anonymous or get out, exit as soon as possible. If not, stay in and enjoy the ride today. So, welcome. You are here for the third installment of the EXALT dialogues. Today we'll be talking about extractivism and decolonial thought. I hope you're ready. Brace yourselves. So, yeah, first, a little bit about EXALT. So, EXALT stands for Global Extractivisms and Alternatives Initiative. This is at the University of Helsinki, organized by a variety of amazing people who are really trying to open up and create a critical space for everyone, not and when I say these things, I mean really looking at the big kind of issues of our time, specifically related to extractivism. So different ways of taking too much and more than what's welcome from environments, people, ideas, and you name it. But more importantly, EXALT is also about looking at alternatives and actually ways to actually mend, heal, change, and to stop this process from happening. So I think it's an important and amazing initiative, and that's why Sana and myself have been organizing the EXALT dialogues, which is really trying to create more of a public space for anyone to show up, to come and talk about these issues. And we're really trying to encourage people who have things they really want to talk about and important kind of political fault lines related to extractivism to come forward and to approach us, even though we're almost booked up until, we almost have next year already booked up. But with this, today, we have an amazing talk on extractivism and decolonial thought. We will be joined, so far, our kind of guest speaker, who I was very excited to have be with us, has not shown up yet, Amanda Lickers, who will be sorely missed, but hopefully they still kind of jump in. Coming from, occupied Turtle Island, but they're not here. So we have the illustrious Kira Asher from Amherst University, who I'm very pleased to be here, who has been a great and excellent participant and critic of actually what's going on in decolonial and post-colonial thought. We have Usman from the University of Helsinki, who has been in some of my PhD courses and has shown himself to be a sharp and cunning individual with great thoughts, ready to kind of talk about these topics. And again, we had another loss. We did not have Jaffe Wilson as originally advertised, but we have an equally great Carlos Tornell, who is just got his PhD from Durham University, and congratulations for that. And today we will be talking about extractivism and decolonial thought. So before we get into everyone and their 15-minute talks, how it's gonna work today. How it's gonna work today is we're gonna begin with, everyone's gonna have about 15 minutes or maybe a little more, since there can be a little more time since Amanda hasn't shown yet, to kind of talk about their piece related to this call. And then before that, maybe try to have the authors and speakers kind of talk with each other before we open up to a general question and answer. And before this, so today, as you saw in the call for this event, is really, we're trying to really get at and have a conversation about the relationship between extractivism and decolonial thought. But really, this also comes down to definitions, and what is kind of pressed here is actually, what is decolonial? What is the colony? And how does this relate to industrialism? How does this relate to state formation? And how does this ultimately relate to extractivism? And that is the mining and all of the processing and industrial processes that go into this. But so I have no idea what our speakers will say today and how they will kind of introduce themselves and what they're going to do. So I'm along for the ride with everyone else. And so let's kick it off. And so when you're ready, Kieran, please let it go.
Thank you, Xander and Sana, for organizing, and thank you all for coming. And at some level, I'm here for the ride too, in the sense that sort of I don't have prepared remarks. I took this as a conversation, which is actually my favorite format to engage in ideas. And I like what you said, Xander, about definitions, because it's the definitions that keep vexing us, and they should, right? It's like, as when I'm teaching undergrads, they want to know, how is this thing defined? And then you find 20 definitions, and then they want to know which is the right one, and then they want to know the origins, and so on and so forth. So I'll start So, okay, I've started already. Beginnings are hard. You kind of start in the middle. So I'll continue in some senses biographically, in the sense that as my first thought when Xander wrote this was, well, I actually don't do extractivism, or I don't work on extractivism per se. The other is, and again, Xander and I have been emailing. He's been very, very gracious in writing, sharing his work, and having a dialogue about these themes that as somebody who's worked in Latin America from, for 30 plus years more, I lose track, I'm getting older every day. But I'm originally from India, and I did work in Colombia, in Afro-Colombian struggles at a moment when the Cold War had just passed, and we were thinking in terms of non-alignment, which is a term that these days, at least my young students don't know, but it's not a register that comes in. And the post-colonial debates, named as such, I was not particularly familiar with. Fast forward 40 years later, all of a sudden, nobody sees me as doing work in Latin America, and I'm not a Latin Americanist, I'm a post-colonialist, because there was this decolonial debate which had to do with the fact that post-colonial was understood as being after the colony. And so like 90% of my work, I sort of find myself in the middle, and 90% of my life, I find myself in the middle of arguments and fights, which I haven't really chosen, they choose me, or in positions that I haven't really chosen or who choose me, which also is actually a very useful way of thinking about coloniality, right? None of us chose to be colonized. So for me, the piece that I wrote that Xander was referring to a little while ago was a way to sort of say, wait, what is this post-colonial, decolonial debate? And why is there why is it pitched in as a binary? And so that's sort of a short introduction to how I engage how I got involved in these debates. How do I think about them? Again, it's a question of definition. And then when I started teaching it, there's different moments of decoloniality, decolonization, not as in actually it's happening, but what does it mean? What are those instances that are going on? The first moment one could call sort of the formal moment of formal decolonization, which is also very different. As a Latin Americanist, I think of what's happening in the 1800s, 1900s. As an Indian, I just celebrated Indian Independence Day not so long ago, but India is in what I call the second invited phase of colonization. The first phase, was the Brits, and now it's sort of like it's all about America in an odd kind of way. And its own phase of colonization, in the sense that it's going all around the world, and colonization is both external as well as internal. Anyway, long-winded way of definitions. At some point in my teaching career, I got denounced as a Marxist. And as somebody who I was trained as first as a biologist and then in political science in the United States. And so we hadn't read Marx because it was something that you weren't, it was the ideological tainting of Marx, which still continues. I hadn't read, but somebody did a teaching in my class, denounced me on the web as a Marxist. And I was like, well, I better go read Marx, and discovered that actually, well, I'm a Marxist. So again, long-winded way of saying is that here are these questions that came up, and I was deep in the midst of writing my book, which took me forever to write, thinking about Blackness as non-indigeneity, because in Colombia, indigenous people were considered indigenous and Blacks not. And so this was this very, very analytical, ideological, political way of sort of, all of these things are engaged together, but I'm sort of trying to parse it out. What are these debates? And within those, all of us are always already implicated in all of these places. And I use this phrase because it's useful, and I find Spivak useful. And this is, I think, one of the other reasons why I'm called post-colonial, because I find her amazingly useful to think with. Every time I read her, engage her, my boundaries get pushed. And what I find is that she pushes her own boundaries in ways that I have found relatively few thinkers do. So that if you read her work, she revisits her essays. In some of them, there's literally her own notes. It's like, I was thinking this way then. These were the limits of my thinking. This is why I was thinking that way then. And now I'm thinking this way. So decolonial, post-colonial, long legacy coming from a variety of different places. I've been reading and writing and doing workshops with this for the special issue with a young colleague at UMass called Nicholas Caroli, who's an incredibly generous reader. And as we've been reading these debates, initially I did it in a very quetchy, irritated way, but reading with Nick has been very useful to kind of see the variety of different places where these debates are coming from. And I'll say this and I'll try to stop because I really do want to have a conversation. I was reading sections of Patrick Wolf a little late, and the forum, or revisiting the 2017 forum on his work, Structures of History, that came out after his death, and it was published in the American Quarterly. There's a way in which, where he says that there's a way in which if you take Blackness or indigeneity as sort of ontological givens, there's a way in which they reproduce the precise kind of coloniality that you're trying to disrupt. And in a lot of current debates that I'm seeing, there's even as you're contesting colonialism and coloniality, there's a way in the ways that these categories get reasserted. And to some extent, this is sort of where I'm a Marxist in an analytical sense, right? It's like we produce and are produced, but not under the conditions of our own making. So these debates I think they're useful, they're important, they should be coming up. I don't think these issues are closed. And I think this is what you meant, Xander, that I was having a more generous, more hopeful reading of decoloniality than I did in 2013. So I don't think that analytically my critiques have changed, but what I'm trying to say is that there's things that need to be parsed, and there's good ways in which you can parse it, and there's analytically, let me just say, incorrect ways of parsing things. And this takes me to extractivism, which technically I don't work on, but capitalism is extraction. By definition, it's extraction. And I'll think about extractivism, and I'll, for the moment, substitute the word social reproduction for extraction, or use social reproduction as an extension of extraction, right? Because capitalism needs to expand internally and externally. It just needs to at all times. So in that sense, extraction is just deeply embedded in. So what's happening right now is not new or not surprising, right? It needed to happen. It continues happening. And the extraction or the expansion is internal as well, is that different kinds of processes are being piggybacked upon, my very technical term of capitalism. Sushmita Chatterjee and I wrote a piece a few years ago, which in feminist studies, or maybe it just came out last year in feminist studies, about the role of the animal in COVID capitalism, because everybody was like, oh my God, there's all this wildlife all over the place, and sort of, the silver lining of COVID is going to be that sort of, global warming is going to halt. And there was just a way in which the animal was extremely hyper-present, right? Live animals were hyper-present. At the same time, that notions of essential workers, migrant death, because those were the workers that had to work, right? They were working in abattoirs. So there was a simultaneous way in which certain kinds of life was celebrated and certain kind of death was considered, or certain kinds of lives were not. So I'm thinking about extraction as very much part and parcel of expansion, of capitalist accumulation and expansion. So this is sort of a scattered way of saying how I'm thinking about these issues. I didn't prepare a formal talk. I can talk about some of my other, I didn't prepare a formal talk, but this is the stuff that I'm working on, and I'm working on it in my head a lot. But the empirical work is across two different sites, and because now I'm old and also an administrator, I can't do as much field work as I was doing once upon a time, but I've been wanting to do this work for a long time, where I'm doing comparative work in Colombia and India. I'm originally from India. I wanted to work in parts of the country that I could speak the language, so I finally ended up in the part of the country where my family is originally from. So it's been also an interesting way, and I wanted to do this also because what does it mean to engage colonialism and anti-racism in a place where you occupy? And I read in a very different way. In the United States and in the West, I'm read in one way. In India, even though I don't live there and haven't lived there for 30 plus years, I'm read in a very different kind of way. So this is sort of comparative work in an analytical sense, but also in a political sense of what does it mean to do this kind of a work in a place from where you come from. So it's been interesting to do work on social reproduction broadly understood, continually in the Pacific lowlands of Colombia, where I've been working since 1992, and then the west coast of India, in Kutch, amongst pastoralist communities, because again, the same kind of processes of indigeneity and settlement that are there in Latin American groups are also happening, continuing to happening amongst pastoralist groups, but also the issue of extraction, of different kinds of extraction. So that's the work that I'm doing. And again, as somebody who's a feminist and who's really interested in gender issues, I'm looking at how the different ways in which different categories sort of articulate and interact when extraction happens, and in similar and differential ways in different parts of the world. So that's sort of the empirical work that I'm doing. Anyway, that's kind of my thoughts on extractivism and decolonization, decoloniality, understood in the broadest kind of way. At this moment, I'm not interested in pinning definitions, but thinking about these processes more expansively. So
Awesome.
I'll leave it.
All right, thanks so much. Thanks for sharing that and your work and kind of where you're coming from on this. I have excellent news for everyone. Amanda Lickers has come. So I'm very happy that we have our special guest, but I think we're going to save them the best for last. But again, Amanda, welcome. Thanks for being here. But let's move on with this so we have time. I think next up is the lovely Usman. So please lay it on us. What do you think about all this decoloniality and extractivism? Where are you coming in on this fight?
Thanks, Zenda. So mainly my work is related to the extractivism, and particularly in Pakistan. So Kiran, just on the other side of the border, yeah. And now recently, I'm getting much more interested in this debate on decolonization and so on. So I have felt like when we talk about decolonization in terms of resource extraction context, oftentimes the discussion revolves around these kind of global processes. So for example, imperialist powers and the global capital flows and all these kind of things. So what I want to focus for my this small talk that I have prepared is that I want to focus more on national and local level. And by that, I don't mean to imply that these kind of scales are operating exclusively from each other, right? They are very much interconnected, and they cooperate, at the local level, connecting with the global, and the global doing so with the local and national as well. So in that context, I will focus mainly rather than more on analytically, I will focus more on my case study, that is Pakistan. So some of the observation, I'm sure, are very much applicable to many other territories in the global south. So if we look at the formal kind of, as Kiran was also mentioning, that if we look at the kind of this formal decolonization in the South Asia, so Pakistan, just like India, also got its freedom from in the 1947, and however, this event of decolonization happens in the 1947, not necessarily means the end of the structures of colonization. Borrowing from Patrick Wolf's words, that the colonialism is structure, not event, right? So in Pakistan's term, we do see that this kind of continuity of those structures, still kind of holding on and and going on. So for this, I'll give you two examples for that. So in Pakistan, how the past legacies not only continue, but how they transform. And then I will come to the point, the argument that I want to make about state in terms of colonization. That in the contemporary legal system in Pakistan, it has two major legal procedures: the criminal procedure and the penal code. And both of these are from the British period. So both laws are introduced during the British colonial period, and interestingly, very little has been changed. I don't know how is the situation, for example, in India, but in Pakistan, very little has been changed in either of them. And the majority of the rules and laws remain the same. And this kind of tells us something about the colonization at the national scale. And why I'm saying so is that when these laws, this criminal procedure and the penal code, when they are introduced, it's the British colonial state, and the locals are the colonized, subjugated people, right? So the law, primary kind of rationale behind those laws was to control the colonized, right? And whereas now, for example, the nation state in Pakistan right now, right, using exactly the same laws. So this kind of gives you this hint, like how the legal system is kind of continuing the exactly the same past legacies. So the nation state, in terms of legal structure, has not changed much from what it was during the colonial period, right? So, again, so the thing that I was saying earlier, that like, the event of decolonization happened, but then the structure is still kind of continuing. And so for example, like one of the very interesting example is that the Pakistan Penal Code has this section, it's called Section 144. When invoked, no more than 4 people are allowed to gather in a public space. And that was done purely for the reasons that the British colonial state wanted to control, and whenever there was a chance of resistance to any project or whatever, it was this Section 144 that was implemented. And interestingly, it is exactly the same modus operandi that the nation state is now doing, right? So whenever there is like any kind of violence, threat of violence, or like threat to violence of the violence and resistance to any project, they immediately, the district kind of government invokes this Section 144. So you are not allowed to go out and do any resistance to the project or whatever, right? So this kind of continuity in the legal system, of course, I mean, this kind of makes me like interested into this question, that to think about the nature of the state, right? So the thing that I was saying, that for a colonial state, it's the colonized and those people, whereas for the nation state now, for Pakistan, the relationship or the social contract should be of state and citizen, whereas the legal system points the other way, that it's still the colonizer and the colonized, right? And to give another example of the similar kind of thing is that, so like to govern to govern India and the Indians, unruly, illiterate peoples, the British state introduced what they call the Civil Services Academy, or the Civil Services. That was the way for them to kind of bring in these bright students, train them to become officers, and then these officers go into the civil bureaucracy, to work in the civil bureaucracy, right? And in Pakistan now, the Civil Services Academy, which trains these excellent civil bureaucrats, it's still have the same processes and the same procedures. Yes, they have changed a bit of the kind of syllabus and nitty-gritty of the things, but the overall idea remains the same. And why I'm saying so? So, for example, like through some of my friends who've been down that path, I know that like one of the cores, especially like one training that these officials or like these civil servants get, is that how to be an officer. And the idea is that when they are in that training, that what they learn is that, for example, how an officer speaks, how he eats, how he should not do menial work by himself, but rather the lower staff should do the work because he's an officer. And a kind of interesting anecdote on this, that what this kind of training does with you is that, like, this that like you are there to rule, right? That exactly was the colonial state's idea, right? The officers in there, they had the same idea, that you are there to rule, to govern. And that's exactly what's happening even after the so-called decolonization there in the Pakistan's context. So that like in Pakistan recently, there was this one of these training in this Civil Services Academy, who was about to be graduate or whatever, and he posted a video on social media, on Instagram probably or somewhere. And the caption of that video was getting ready for the first raid. And and supposedly that raid was against the fruit and vegetable vendors who, because of no public space for them, are forced to bring their stalls on the roads. And that's what they, just before that raid, this is what the kind of the idea that I'm trying to kind of argue, that like what it gets into your head, like the kind of this continuity of exactly the same structures that were established during the colonial period kind of continuing now in the contemporary Pakistan state or the institutional setup. And yes, I mean, of course, there is this part of the discussion on decolonization and the continuity and the thing that I'm saying. But what fascinates me more is the question on the nature of state from these two examples. That's what I want to kind of draw my conclusion on. That as the essence of the question of decolonization is to get rid of the structures and to get rid of the colonizer. And if the state itself is the colonizer, then the answer is probably we need to talk about getting rid of the state, right? Okay, I know this might sound a bit too radical of a position to say, but I think the structure of the violence that we want to address through like decolonization or like and the structure of this violence, the structure of this subjugation is such that that's how it is. So if we want to talk of like decolonization, particularly in this like local or the national scales, then I think the question of the state is like central to it, because if we look at this in terms of extractivism, then right. So on one hand, we have this continuation and the past legacies of the colonial structures still going on in many of the countries in the global south, but so is the contemporary modus operandi of the state in many of these areas. So, for example, the area that I do my research on, Tharparkar, it's a district in the south of the country, and it's part of the, again, the colonial term is that is part of the great Indian desert, right? And being the desert, it is a terraneous, right? There exists nothing. There is no form of life that exists there. And it was terraneous for the British state as well, because they were not interested in doing anything. And so was it for the nation state, the Pakistani nation state. But like in 1994, they discovered like, oh, there are huge coal reserves in that area. And now under the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, this area kind of becomes the forefront, like the new frontier of resource extraction in Pakistan and the energy development. But now, because this is a desert and exists nothing in there, but on the contrary, this desert, the Tharparkar, is the district which has the biggest livestock population in the whole country, right? So this kind of discursive, creation of desert of Tharparkar, it does not actually sits well with the kind of, the facts about the place. And because I mean, as I was saying, that it's like the kind of that it's a that is part of the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. So China critic could argue that like, oh, this is Chinese imperialism at play, and maybe the Western imperialism is different and all that, and maybe their Nordic version might be much better and so on. But the point that I want to focus on is that, for example, in Tharparkar, there are now Pakistani corporation was actually the first one to do this process. Then came the Chinese. Now UAE and Britain are going to be there and all that. But in kind of the facilitator for all of these as the state, it is the one for which I remember this very vividly. I was talking to one of the land revenue official, and I asked them like, oh, can I get the maps of the area? And he said, what kind of maps do you want? It's just sand dunes there. So, like the area did not exist in the imagination of the state before that. So it kind of like so for me, it's of the like actually the state that's like not only like facilitating this, the whole, this kind of the whole plunder and exploitation and the appropriation of the resources in the extractive in the context of extractivism, but also I think that that the state being at the service of the capital also means that through coercion and the violence and through many other ways, it is subjugating the locals, the people, the indigenous 30 people to the capitalist modernity, those ideologies, right, that we talk about, and in a way restructuring the local communities to a different way of living and being and their connection with the nature and so on. And I see Xander, and I think it's like time for me now, so I'll shut up.
Oh, Usman, a man after my own heart. Decolonial struggle is anti-state struggle. I'm loving it. I'm loving it. But I don't want you to shut up. But we got to make some space for our two other lovely speakers. And plus, we started a little late with all the introductions. But thank you so much. It was really nice to hear that. It was actually very refreshing for a lot of the issues that I find concerning within academic decolonial thinking. But now, moving on to the beloved Carlos Tornell. Please, what's on your mind? How you feeling? Drop it on us. Tell us what's
Thanks,
good.
Sander. Thanks, Sander, and thanks everyone. It's lovely to be here. And yeah, I hope if there are some very diehard Jaffe Wilson fans, won't be disappointed with me being here in his stead. But I'll try my best. And I also have to apologize because I did do a presentation. It's just a couple of slides, but I will use it because if not, I know I will talk all over the place. So I hope I am forgiven for that. Let me just share with you my screen really quickly. There we go. Can you see it? Yes? Okay. Let me just now see how to do that. Okay. So I'll now try to walk you through this really quickly. I try to be a little bit provocative here, and this is something I've been in dialogue with Sander for a while now, which is like, is decoloniality holding back reversal possibilities? I'll try to go a little bit into this as I go in as to why I'm asking this question. But this is, I think, where what I wanted to sort of make some points here. So as Kiran was saying at the beginning, this is all about definitions, right? So I think this is everything, something we all know now, but it's the origins of extraction, or is its material, right? It's material extraction. Now it would be something like neo-extractivism in Latin America, but basically it's this idea of this mode of accumulation that has established around 500 years ago. So it's embedded in the origin of coloniality, I think, in the notion of coloniality, and it's around this center periphery, idea where again producing, some countries are producing in nature and others are importing it, right? So these I think are constitutive parts of capitalism. Then again, we have an extended notion of extraction now, which would expand to agriculture, fishing, forestry. So it's not only the raw materials, the hydrocarbons, but now includes also financialization, logistics, and an extractive global commodity chains. So this again is a global enterprise. It's expanding progressively, and now I think we're in a moment where I very much like this definition. We could talk about total extraction, which extraction has become the dominant mentality of our times, right? A global totality of material and resource appropriation, and it also includes financial, logistical, as I was saying, data, information mining, but it's also epistemic. So we are also extracting knowledge. We are also extracting ways of knowing and being in the world, and this is why I think we could talk of extraction being something ontological, right? It universalizes, normalizes multiple types of violence, expanding sacrifice zones and cost-shifting strategies. And now it's also legitimizing what we call the green promises, right? The possibilities of a green transition. So it's also necropolitics. It's a way of organizing, managing what lives, who is subjugated by the power of death, and who gets to enjoy or benefit from that. Yeah. So yeah, again, really quickly, this is, I think, the decolonial discussion. We are more or less everybody's in tune with, but I just wanted to bring it into also to sort of point that out. So we have, the idea of coloniality of power coming from Quijano, which is again creating racial hierarchies and institutionalizing them through the power of the state, private property, stuff like that. Then we have people like Nelson Maldonado Torres, drawing a little bit on Fanon, where he talks about coloniality of being, right? These are the mechanisms of subjugation of life, body and mind. I think this is something that Usman was talking about just a moment ago, right? This coloniality is something like a seed that is grown in people's minds. It's also polluting, let's say, their mentality. The colonized then behave like the colonizer, and that is something that maybe we should discuss a little bit further. And then we have Miguel talking about the coloniality of knowledge, right? There's a dark side to the progress of modernity, and then European knowledge and the symbolization system of the European is input over every other non-European ones. But then we also have Maria Lugones, who also said, well, there's also coloniality of gender, right? Gender facilitated that colonial power structure to be manifested, and even Quijano himself didn't assess this part. So we also have to take that into account, how gender and power are entangled and are elements that facilitate colonialism. But then again, when we come to the question of academia, when we come to the question of how from where we are thinking, we also have to think of epistemic extraction, right? So Ramon Grossfogel is the one who has talked a little bit about this. But basically, this idea is that we are extracting ideas from indigenous communities, removing them from context in which they were produced, and depoliticizes them, bringing into the Western-centric logic. So, think of from everything from sustainable development to buen vivir, have been adopted in one way or another to facilitate the progress of the state, to facilitate populist strategies to legitimate extraction. For example, in Latin America, that's very clear. So I think this is something we should take into account, right? In academia as well, it's a formulation in the service of sustaining, let's say, a subject-object relation, instead of actually accounting for the knowledges emerging from the territory, from the ground. So it can easily be co-opted to sustain a power relation, or the already existing power relations, I would say. And if we talk about academic extraction, we are now talking about decolonizing everything, which I think is a trend that is happening quite everywhere, basically, right? The governments are talking about decolonization, academic institutions are talking about decolonization. But what do we risk when we talk about decolonizing everything, right? I think one, as Alexander has written very, very nicely, we're sort of like risking legitimizing middle-class guilt and academic code in the name of decolonial praxis. We are also reproducing epistemic extractive relationships or power relations that already exist under doing the colonial work, and I think this is something that we should discuss a bit. I am, of course, trying to be provocative here, but this is, I think, something that can happen when we just talk about decolonization everything without actually going into what we mean when we do that. And it's a way of, I think, justifying privilege and liberal thought through inclusion and recognition. So like late liberalism, it's a way of including something that is different, but marginally putting them into our framework. It's not necessarily actually recognizing something. So it's like Glenn Sean Couthard would argue, or Elizabeth Pominelli would argue, is how we deal with difference in late liberal societies. And an alternative will think, well, what about thinking in different terms? What about Unitierra in Oaxaca in Mexico? I think is a nice example of thinking of how we decolonize everything. But going beyond the traditional way of thinking what a university is, how it's supposed to operate, what are the things that are being taught, and by whom, right? What are the points that we need to account there? So I think I identified at least 3 limits of these decolonial possibilities. And the first one, I think, is something that Ivan Illich was talking about, which is over-specialization. I think it happens when you invent a tradition a posteriori, by searching for its genealogy and consecrating its classics. Then you create, what you constitute what is part of the field, what is not, and it's often closed under an identity card. You create study programs, publications, faculties, generalize a canon, and then produce, an over-specialization around it, right? A friend of mine, Elias Gonzalez, has written a little bit about this, and it's quite interesting, I think. And then I think Silvia Rivera also points to this point. Silvia Cosicankis, he says, a new academic canon using a world of references and counter-references that establish hierarchies to adopt new gurus, right? So we are over-specializing the colonial theory can lead into this thing of citations games, And I think this is also the second point I want to bring in, which is like, when we talk about geopolitics of knowledge or the political economy of knowledge, right? So this I think emerge when we talk about who is allowed to think or created decolonial thought. Mignolo, for example, created this idea of geopolitics of knowledges, where I think it can be essentializing identities quite a lot, because basically, if you come from Europe, you are by definition you cannot do decolonial thought. And if you're from the Americas, from anywhere in Abrayala or Turtle Island, you are by definition decolonial. And I think this completely misses the point of the political affinities that are between people. So people do not have to be de facto one or the other, right? They have the possibility of moving from one or the other. So, and also there's a political economy of knowledge that we should account for. Who gets the ideas, the salaries, the perks, the privilege of producing ideas, that they are extracted from the south, produced thought in the north, or maybe the north in the south as well, and then fed back as academic concepts to use for the people in the south again. So I think that's quite problematic, right? So we need to decenter, I think, the identity card without, of course, recognizing that it exists. But we need to think again, work with societies in movements and putting power relations at the center would be my point there. And I think this is also important when we talk about how to decolonize the state. Again, something that Usman was already talking about. But can we think about decolonizing through the state? I think we tried that. We have the experience of the pink tide in Latin America, where Evo Morales, Correa, have tried to do a little bit something like that, recognizing buen vivir in the constitution, rights of nature, stuff like that. But I think, as I think also was said before, the state is itself, its origins is a colonial institution. So when we talk about internal colonization and colonialism as an empire of colonization, I think they are mutually constitutive, right? When we think about late liberal societies, I think one and the other are informing itself constantly. Joe Turner has written a wonderful piece about this, where he basically argues, well, the state, I think, is a continuation of the colony, right? The governmentality of empire was tested through the internal colonialisms in the north. So if you think of how the Spanish colonized the Americas, they tried their policies, let's say, on the Arab population and the Muslim populations that they were expelling, right, in the late 15th century. So I think we should take that into account as well. These are mutually constitutive dialogues that need to be taken together, right? And I think the state is a great appropriator of these traditions. And I love this picture of Andrés Manuel Observador as the president of Mexico. He's there asking permission to nature before he builds the Maya train, right? So he's, again, taking advantage of indigenous rituals to sort of legitimize the practice of extraction. But again, from buen vivir to the rights of nature, it enforces capitalism. And, this is a substitution in one ruling class for the other. Again, the pink tide, I think, did that quite literally. So again, and decolonial scholars do not break with the state, which is, I think, quite paradoxical for me. Boaventura Sousa Santos or people like that are supporting Andrés Manuel López Obrador in Mexico. And I find that quite puzzling if we're talking about how that operates within decolonial thought. How are we trying to reformulate the state if the state is per se a colonial institution? So, and this is where I come to, I think, one of the last points, which is whatever happened to post-development, right? Post-development was already making a critique rooted in the reliance of technological progress, and this idea that we always have to move forward, we always have to have more, keep going, a reliance on experts for, measuring everything under the terms of like global capitalism and or let's say capitalist modernity, how it operates. And it created what Illich called the needy man, right? It substituted nature for resources, and it embedded this idea of progress that was already embedded in colonial practice and thought. So I think, I think we should go back and listen a little bit to what post-development was saying right now, 30 years ago, actually. So post-development stands, I think this is from the Pluriverse Dictionary, as a broad transcultural compilation of concrete concepts, worldviews, and practices from around the world, challenging this modernist ontology for universalism in which favor a multiple worlds can exist, right? So again, drawing on the Zapatistas, on these principles of what is actually possible. And I'm almost done now, but I think it's important to identify political affinity as a ruling, something that can create this coercion, this possibility, this cooperation between not only thinking about identity, but what are the possibilities that emerge from the dialogue between struggles, between practices, right? So the question I think would be here, like then in decolonial thought, what do we do with Western thought, right? Should we just discount it? Should we just like eliminate it? And I think we should also consider that no, there are strands within within modern thought that are critical of modernity and need to be considered so that we can produce an actual pluriverse, I would say. And Ines Esaide said it beautifully when he said, we're talking about not provincialisms, but a universal enriched by all that is particulars. So all these many particulars can create a universal alternative possibility, right? This is something I've been writing with Sander. So again, centering political affinity and a vision can reveal more than an identity, right? Even if it's the two are not mutually exclusive. But if we think of like rainbow coalitions in the 60s from the Panthers and all of that, we sort of learned that there's a possibility of creating these alliances and contesting capitalist modernity through those different struggles, different and ideas, utopias of possibilities. So the pluriverse aims for a relative unity through diversity, right? Which imposes implies rooting anti-capitalism and anti-statism into a pluriversal struggle. I think I love how Gustavo Esteve phrased this. He would say it's a rebellious everyday dispersion, right? It's an insurrection that happens in the everyday through the everyday practices where individuals are substituting nouns, which make you dependent, like food, education, health, housing, for verbs that allow us to take back center the power of control, which is like eat, learn, heal, inhabit, share, etc. Right? And yeah, just to finish, I think with Jaffe, because I think Jaffe was. Of course, I wouldn't presume to be talking in his name, but I think Jaffe made quite a nice contribution to this when he was talking about extraction and universality. So I think for us to think about the terms of think about the pluriverse, we should consider that the pluriverse comes from post-development thought, but also from decolonial thought, right? There's Dussell's idea of transmodernity, which is like this epistemic diversity as a universal project, which we can think about like as the Zapatistas, a world with many worlds fit. And there's also the post-development idea, which is again recovering the many alternatives to development, right? Again, this idea of many words, many pluralities can coexist with each other, and there's a possibility of dialogue between them, which is what I will say next. But how do we engage that from the academia? How do we do that? We're thinking in these two terms. I think one of the ways is doing militant research. This is a nice phrase by Sam Halvorson, where he talks about prioritizing political struggle over academic pursuit of knowledge, right? How do we create this solidarity and committed practice in thinking, feeling, doing with societies in movement, right? And I would just add that the pluriverse is not the opposite of Western modernity, right? It also includes some of this critical thinking within modernity. So I think this is why there are bits of Marx that are relevant and useful, but also the anarchist tradition, which is, I think, nailed it quite a lot better for thinking about what do we do with the state and how do we, create an alternative, right? And this is my last slide. I know I'm seeing Sander now, but think about alternatives. I think we need to territorialize and weave the multiple knowledges together. So ideas like the global tapestry of alternatives are trying to do that, putting this into dialogue, into many alternatives and processes, possibilities. And of course, this is, again, a localized struggle. This is all around energy, but we are seeing alternatives, insurrectionalist possibilities emerging through different territories and practices around relationships to energy. So yeah, I would just leave it there. I hope I wasn't too too fast. But yeah, looking forward to the discussion, and thank you all very much.
All right, excellent, Carlos. I was trying to discourage presentations, but I was just proved wrong. And it was really nice to see some of those images on there. And said greatly. Thank you for sharing. And finally, the illustrious Amanda Lickers. Super pleased to have you here. And you're on mute. But yeah, maybe introduce yourself or do what you got to do and say what you got to say regarding extractivism and decolonial thought.
Cool. Well, Sego Sewagwego, Yigotsorare Yunjits. Greetings, everyone. My name is Yigotsorare Amanda Lickers. I'm a Seneca of Six Nations of the Grand River, which is a community just west of Toronto, Ontario. We're a part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, which you don't know, you should know. We invented democracy. No, just kidding. But we kind of did. Like the United States literally pilfered their, speaking of epistemic extractivism, the United States structure of government was literally taken from our structure of government. And they use something like the eagle with like clutching the arrows, like they're, stealing our symbols. Anyways, so yeah, I guess like my background is from a grassroots like organizing experience, working against tar sands expansion, fracking, uranium, just all forms of resource extraction in environmental violence, and also in like cultural revitalization, you could say. Anyways, so yeah, okay, I have a few, I kind of want to respond first to some things, like just to sort of like make some notes, and like I found it very interesting what everyone had to say. And obviously like my perspective of decoloniality is like coming from a very specific context. But I really found like the naming of epistemic extraction very useful. And especially to me, that's highlighting even through Marxism and socialism, because Karl Marx actually came to the New World, so-called, and he actually studied Haudenosaunee culture and politics and ways of organizing. And a lot of these like Western socialist political ontologies were modeled on indigenous ways of doing and being. And so I think that gets highly invisibilized, especially in like progressive spaces. And I think it's very important to sort of track these knowledges back to their origins, and including even the conversation of verb-based relations. A lot of our languages, at least in Turtle Island, are actually verb-based, and we don't use a lot of nouns. So for example, so those are some things that I wanted to note. Yes, okay, so yeah, and then so in terms of decoloniality, I think that some of Carlos's critiques were very on. And for me, the way that I've actually been trying to frame the conversation is around anti-colonialism, whereas like anti-colonialism is for everyone. It doesn't matter who you are, where you're from, you can participate in anti-colonial struggle, and your job is to literally attack the structures. So like these neo-colonial, colonial, extractive, capitalist structures need to be attacked. And that, you know, and whereas like, because decolonization, I think, is very linked to indigenization, and it gets appropriated by the state and various actors. And for me, it's like decolonizing is for those who are needing to reclaim their identities and indigenize. So whose languages have been stolen from them, whose territories have been they've been displaced from. So for me, I take a little bit more of a closed perspective to decoloniality, and I think that there's ways for, you know, whiteness to be decolonized. It's obviously like a structure of modernity, but you know, that doesn't change the power relations. So anyway, so that's just kind of my initial thoughts on that piece. So I have actually just like 3 little slides just to sort of frame some of my conversation. Let's see if I can remember how to use Zoom. Share screen. Okie doke. Just give me a second here. So yeah, I'm based in so-called Montreal. We call it Tiohtià:ke. This is occupied Kanien'kehá:ka territory, which is otherwise, I guess, colloquially known as the Mohawks. And they're part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, which is we're originally 5 nations and later adopted the Tuscarora, who were fleeing colonial expansionism in their territories. So, okay, this is very just simple, like this is not very advanced. Let me see, where'd it go? I'm trying to slideshow this. Okay, is it full screen for you guys? Yes. Okay, so this is just like, God damn it. Okay, back. Okay. So this is like my take on a land acknowledgement. I think that land acknowledgements are extremely useless for the most part, in terms of they're not action-based. They just serve as a way to assuage like settler guilt on territory, and often they're inaccurate. People are not even getting, and like it's like use the correct place names, learn how to pronounce indigenous nations names in our own languages using our autonyms. And then the question is, so what, you know, like, so land acknowledgement, how about land back? And, you know, people will say like, I saw like a tweet that was like, every month I give my landlord a rent acknowledgement instead of paying rent, like you're going to get evicted. So acknowledging what, and so I think acknowledgement should be verb-based, it should be action-based, and it should be through attacking structures of settler colonialism and aligning yourself with indigenous sovereigntist movements. And I'll talk a little bit about that phrasing of sovereignty in a second. And so the reason that I use this clip is it's very relevant to not only where I live as part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, but also it was a very critical moment in anti-colonial history that really resurged the warrior spirit amongst indigenous nations across Turtle Island and even globally. I've heard from indigenous folks in so-called Australia that the use of what we call the warrior flag or the unity flag is something that has really helped to inspire resistance, and they include in some of their anti-colonial movements. And so what we see here is the actual relationship between beautiful multicultural Canada. Everyone thinks Canada is so cute, but this is the relationship that Canada has with Indigenous peoples, and it's through razor wire. And another reason that I like this clip in particular is because it shows a Mohawk warrior literally pushing back on the Canadian state, which is what not only our people are known for, but this is what decolonization is. We have to push back the state, very literally, because they are infringing not only on our territory, but our ways of knowing, our ways of being, even our futurity. So if you don't know, this is actually a clip from Alanis Obomsawin, who is an Abenaki filmmaker. She's with the National Film Board of Canada. It's a documentary, 270 Years of Resistance, Gunnasadage, Protection of the Pine. So it's talking about the 1990 Oka crisis, which if you don't know, you should look it up for sure. It was very instrumental in really igniting, like obviously there was like the 70s and AIM and the Black Panthers and Brown Beret, but in the beginning of the 90s, especially in Canada, you have 1990, the Oka crisis, 1995, Dudley George was killed by the OPP, which is the Ontario Provincial Police. We can't spell oppression without OPP, in actually a national park that is Anishinaabe traditional territory and a burial site. And there was the reoccupation of Anishinaabe Park near Kenora, Ontario. You have the Testepin land defenders, and out in Secwepemc territory where there was a standoff and there was like over, I think 40,000 rounds of like bullets that were fired at these like Secwepemc warriors in the West Coast near so-called Kamloops. They were protecting their Sundance site. So the 90s was very militarized, a lot of confrontations with the state, and some of those elders really helped to support contemporary movement struggles, and where we have, things that what's happening with the Wet'suwet'en today. So I just wanted to sort of establish that as the starting point for Indigenous peoples, at least in my context. And yeah, okay. So Indigenous, what the fuck is that? So basically that means that we have a relationship to the land that's very different than non-Indigenous cultures. Not all cultures that are non-Western are Indigenous. So this is some art. It's cut off. The artist's name is Mindano. I think they're from Brazil. And it shows like an Amazonian Indigenous person holding a sign. We are not defending nature. We are nature defending itself. So this is a major worldview clash that is distinct for Indigenous peoples, where we are not separate from the natural world. We are part of the ecology. So the link between land and lifeways is reciprocal. It goes both ways. And we have a place-based relationship. Okay, so I'm Indigenous to a specific territory. When I go off of that territory, I am not Indigenous to that land. I'm not Indigenous to all of North America. I'm Indigenous to a very specific place that has protocols. We have our own governance structures. We have our own languages, our own laws, and that tie me ancestrally to that land. It's a symbiotic and familial relationship with our territories. Very literally, our languages, our laws, our lifeways come from the territory. We have creation stories and emergence sites and ceremonies that originate from the land. And when I say emergence sites, we talk about through our oral tradition that there are specific places where we came from within our territories. And so that also the relationship of Indigenous placekeeping on our territory is also one that is positive for the land. So when we engage in controlled burns, there's no forest fires, when we are harvesting and doing something like what is now called within Western like thought, like permaculture, you know, these are, again, our concepts are technologies, if you will. This is our Indigenous sciences. And so that actually has a very positive impact on the land itself. So for example, you guys may or may not know someone named Robin Wall Kimmerer, who is a Potawatomi ethnobotanist. She wrote a book called Braiding Sweetgrass. In it, she talks about a case study of implementing the honorable harvest on some patches of sweetgrass. And so the honorable harvest, I'm not going to get into that, but those are the protocols that we are bound to when we harvest from our territories. And it's also incorporates deep time. So it's like past, present, and future. And so what they do is one patch of sweetgrass, they don't harvest. Another patch of sweetgrass, they harvest like in a very extractive capitalist way. So they over harvest, and then the other patch they harvest according to the principles of honorable harvest. And what they see is actually the sweetgrass does extremely well. It actually, the rhizomes shoot out and it propagates more than even the one that was untouched. So this is where that relationship with Indigenous lifeways to the land is actually propagating. It's actually increasing biodiversity and allowing for you know, a more bountiful, and that's another thing, abundance is very key when it comes to at least Turtle Island Indigenous worldviews. So we're talking about like decoloniality. This is like how I teach my students about understanding some of these concepts and really bringing it back to, at least for our context, it's terra nullius and the doctrine of discovery. And I think this has a huge impact worldwide because how they perfected colonialism in North and South America was then exported and is now, you know, just how globalization operates. So the visual aid, I guess you could say. So terra nullius, you guys probably all know what that means. Terra, earth, nullius, empty, is rape culture. And so this is drawing like this is like an interconnected teaching tool to help to understand, because most people kind of would know theoretically what rape culture is. So I'm getting some phone calls. And so what I'm showing here, is so some fracking machines literally cracking in and penetrating the earth. And then in the back, it's just to sort of show the connection to the land. And this is part of Haudenosaunee visual culture, and they're called sky domes. And they have they are multi-meaning making symbols. So terra nullius does a few things. So first, it imposes a colonial inanimation of the land. And so the land becomes objectified and it becomes dead, inanimate, and human beings become separate. That is the first critical disconnection that takes place. Alongside the doctrine of discovery, it establishes a false hierarchy and a legal framework and justification of who's human and who's subhuman. And this is obviously going to justify genocide, slavery, you know, and so this is a big deal. And why rape culture? There's a lot of parallels and co-occurring patterns. Consent is the ability to say yes or no freely, so without duress. It cannot be coerced or under duress, which is pressure or forced. Consent must be informed, so all information is made clear. If there is an important piece of information that could affect your decision, it is disclosed and made available to your knowledge in advance. And so, for example, the Haudenosaunee, we made, so as Indigenous peoples of North America, we have confederacies across our distinct nations and cultures, where we basically have various nation to nation, you could call it international law. We have agreements on how to conduct ourselves, how to avoid war, how to share our territory. And so we implemented some of these agreements with colonizers when they arrived. And the Dutch were the first one to get in on the two-row wampum, which I'm not going to go into the whole history lesson, but I definitely could. But the two-row wampum, so as Indigenous people, we use well, at least in the Northeast, where we use wampum to sort of codify our legal frameworks and use them as mnemonic devices. And so wampum are beads that are carved from shells, different shells, the whelk shell and quahog shells, so they're purple and white, and then they're woven into these belts that show different patterns, and that's the storytelling. And so that's passed on. And so when different folks would travel across the territories, going into other people's territories, they would carry certain belts to show like, oh, I'm just passing through. And we have protocols such as the edge of the wood ceremony, where when you come up to the territorial boundary, you light up giant fire, a fairly large fire, and you wait until someone comes, a messenger, and then you undergo the edge of the woods protocol, and it's part of Indigenous governance practices. And so the Wet'suwet'en also do something like this. You have to undergo a protocol in order to enter their territory, and it's not guaranteed that you will, even if you have relations, it is not guaranteed that you will be allowed into the territory. They're going to ask you a series of questions, and based on those answers, you're going to either be allowed access or not. And the idea is that it's up to them, and they have the ability to determine who can or cannot come into their territory. And so also within terra nullius is the normalization of settlement. So like people just take for granted very much so that this is like an ongoing military occupation, at least in North America and South America and other territories as well, settler colonial territories. And that it's literally, in order to have housing on Indigenous land, it requires breach consent and Indigenous displacement, as well as often death. And when it comes to like the necropolitics piece, I thought that was very good. And also, as Indigenous people of North America, that's like one of our distinctions, where our value is in our disappearance. Which became very political when they established who is quote Indigenous and who is Black, when obviously Blackness is inherently Indigenous as well. But because the colonizers really sought to break up those alliances, they created very different ways of being colonized and subjugated within the settler state. And like that's where you have the creation of reservation apartheid to remove Indigenous people from urban or early settlements. Because, for example, you have like the Seminole Nation in Southern Florida, which is literally a collaboration of Miccosukee Indigenous people and freedmen and Maroons, who they killed the most Spaniards. Like they really did well. And so that was very scary, how African Indigenous and Turtle Island Indigenous would collaborate. And so there was various structures put in place. And that's something that Spain did extremely well, with a very hyper, I guess you could say, I don't know, categorization of who, like, there's, I mean, I'm not a Spanish speaker, but my awareness of that, there's even like very specific words of like your mom's mom's mom, and like your, who is Native, who is Black, who is European, and just a very particular caste system. Anyways, and then again, another parallel with rape culture is the criminalization, punishment, and silencing of dissent. So as Indigenous peoples say no as we speak up, and we're literally thrown in jail or worse. And again, with the hyper-normalization of settlement and the assumption of terra nullius, like the assumption that our land is open and available for access. And just to sort of, there's a Tuscarora scholar named Jolene Rickard who talks about this Indigenous phenomenon, mostly starting, I think, you could say in the 70s, maybe, where Indigenous peoples, we started sort of co-opting this phrase of sovereignty to sort of play back on this Western notion of statism, and like really speaking to our inherent responsibilities. So back to that family model, as Indigenous peoples, we have a responsibility to our territory, to our community, to other aspects of our ecosystem, so animals, non-humans, as well as what we say in Haudenosaunee culture is the face is not yet born. And so that's like the responsibility of, you know, like if you're a partner, like you have a responsibility to your partner. That's not a right that's given and taken away by the state. If you have children as a parent, you have a responsibility to your children. That's an inherent bond through your relation. And that's not something that can be determined by the state, although it can definitely be interfered by. And so when Indigenous peoples are talking about sovereignty, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about our inherent responsibility to our territory and our connection to those lands. Our autonomy is our ability to act, you know, of our own well-being and values, and self-determination, the ability to make choices for our own lives. So that's pretty much my presentation.
All right.
There you go.
Punching, setting shit straight. I like it. Killing it over there. All right. So this leads us to the second part of this, where I think I'm going to at least set aside, or we'll see how this starts, to have people talk with each other on the panel. If there's any amongst the participants here, if there's any kind of cross questions or any way anyone wants to get at it before we open it up for a general question and answer. So yeah, Kirin, Carlos, Usman, Amanda, please ask each other questions. If not, I'll start asking you questions.
May I, Zeta?
Get in there.
Yeah. I'm just like kind of want to pick your thoughts, Carlos, on this. Like, you know, when we are talking of when you were talking of, like, you know, this kind of pluriverse and, like, you know, this post-development kind of these ideas that, like, I mean, I remember this discussions with one of Zender's class actually on this. Like, you know, we were talking of degrowth as alternative and in this kind of context. And at least in degrowth context, it seems that, like, there is one paper that actually kind of tracks down that about more than 70% of the proposals of degrowth are geared towards, like, state doing those things. And, you know, and so if we, I mean, yes, on a theoretical level, yes, like post-development and these kind of ideas, they do, like, you know, they're very interesting, and yes, they have the potential and all that, and so does the degrowth as well. But, like, how do you see, like, this kind of, you know, I want to, like, you know, I want to pick your brain on this, like, who is the one to kind of, you know, do this, like, the kind of the transition, the scale of transition that we are talking of, like, particularly given, you know, when there are structures which are there to oppose that transformation, right? So, you know, like states and, like, you know, the global structure of capital and all that, like, you know, kind of actively resisting the transformation. And, like, you know, how do you see, like, this kind of, you know, the possibility of transformation or alternatives in this? Like, yeah, just want to hear your thoughts on this. Like,
yeah, no, thank you very much, Usman. Sorry, I think we can also open it up to Kiran and Amanda.
Please.
Yeah. But I think it's a very good question, right? The growth as a concept, of course, maybe originated, let's say, in Europe. It has a Eurocentric vision, let's say.
Yeah.
It might also be embedded within modernity, which is kind of interesting. This is not to say that we shouldn't take it into account, right? That's, I think, one of the points I was trying to make. But my problem would be if we take it as an umbrella concept, as they say, right? That it should encompass everything. No, I mean, the nice thing about the pluriversal, the book, the post-development dictionary, is that it brings it as part of the many multiple alternatives that exist, right? Because as Amanda and Kiran were saying, there are different ways that are place-based of understanding how, you know, when I talk about justice, and I've been discussing a lot this with Sander, we tend to think of it as a place-based strategy. It's not a universalized concept that you can build in and put something in it, right? So justice is I guess an empty signifier. It would only make sense if we look at it from the territory, like from that particular history, the colonial struggles that are particular of that place. So I think the growth, maybe some people, in Europe could find a way to make the growth useful through the state, but in Latin America, at least for Emerald, that doesn't make any sense, right? It's ludicrous first to talk about the growth because we never grew, let's say. So it's kind of weird to say like, oh, the grow, wait, what do you mean? But we do find affinity with what the growth utopia thinks of, right? It's like we are rejecting development. We are rejecting this idea that we can pursue a perpetual growth because the idea of growth is embedded in development. So we do find affinity with that, right? But it's not to say that we will adopt what Europe does, right? Or what Spain or Portugal do with their degrowth process, because again, it's part of the North. But we build that then if we talk about, we go to Oaxaca, it's talking about communalities, right? It's talking about Buen Vivir in the south. It's talking about, Yiquenemequis in Puebla. So it's different ideas, notions that are built in and put together. But the dialogue between those, I think, is what's beautiful. Where it's what really builds my hope. It puts my dignified rage in the right place, right? What is the enemy here? Or who are we contesting? And then from there, we build something different, But yeah, I don't know. I hope I more or less answer your question. But I would say like the growth is useful, but it's not the only tool we have, right? We have to look at the many alternatives that are place-based, that are territorialized. And if I just I can just now maybe move to what Amanda and Kiran were saying. I was really struck about how Amanda was using this idea of terra nullius, I've also seen this with like the process of energy transitions. When we talk about solar and wind potential, there is a notion of simplifying landscapes, territories, places, saying like, oh, there's potential here, let's extract it, right? And I think this again also shows how this notion of, how capitalism is a radical simplification of like the many complexities and structures of life, But I just wanted to bring that in as well. I thought that that notion of like simplifying everything into what it can be possibly converted to, right? Resources. And of course, as technology advances, as we increase that, the rate of exploitation of people, of nature, of places, and everything expands, right? So I just wanted to bring that in. I was really struck by that. But yeah.
I think just to add on this, like this idea of like terminalist, I think it's like really interesting to understand like the kind of how we understand development as well, right? Because once you are able to establish, let's say discursively even, that like the land is empty, then the argument is built like, oh, development is going to bring things there, right? But if the land is already full, they don't need the development that you are trying to offer, right? But so once that place is like empty and there, no life form exists, then it's the positive addition in there. But what, of course, like is kind of the hidden, the whole actually the kind of the whole exploitation and what the development takes away from the those people and the from that land, right? So that is not. If that is only possible if the land is not terra nullius. Yes, there exists land that you're taking away and replacing it with another kind of way of being and way of living there, right? So I think, in that sense, like really kind of interesting. And I mean, for me, it's like, because this doesn't really, from my field work, that doesn't really been created like this. Like, you have total contradictory facts to it, that it is not a desert. Yes, okay, official category is desert, like, because of the rainfall and all that. But it is very lively place. I mean, just before a while ago, actually, a friend of mine, he's from that area. He's there, and he mentioned that like there are 2 million people and 3.5 million livestock population in that area. What kind of desert it is, right? But it is desert. Just as the Board of Revenue says, it's just the sand dunes there. So I think it's like really interesting that what Amanda and you also mentioned, like this whole idea of creating the empty space, no life form existing. Please, Amanda and Kiran, please, sorry.
Yeah, I just want to jump into that as well. And like, even just like this concept of resources, like the way when I speak to my students about it, it's like, it's like looking at, you know, it's like monetizing your familial relations and like, okay, I'm gonna, you know, like looking at, you know, your favorite sibling or cousin and being like, okay, your kidney is worth this much on like an organ sale. And so I'm going to harvest that kidney because this is a resource and like, I'm going to resell it. And like, that's really the, like that colonial inanimation of land that's being objectified and then brought through like a monetary system through capitalism and seeing the land as resources. And this is where like, as Indigenous peoples, we talk a lot about sacred sites and having things being sacred. And even like the Tohono O'odham in the Sonora Desert, they are in like the Arizona and like also in some in Mexico talking about certain sacred sites and like they would become zombie, like they're like our sense of identity is under attack if these sacred sites are being destroyed. And so this like really even ties into like our cultural identity, our sense of nationhood, sovereignty, our futurity, and also like that deep time connection to our ancestors. So I think like this is like another question of like, so how do we move away then and reframe like looking at and I've heard a lot of people say this phrase now, future generations, which really I don't love hearing that because it's one of those episystemic extractivisms. But it is something that we need to start thinking about of relating to the land and this idea of like what is development and even technological progress. Like I'm in grad school right now and like I'm focusing on basically I'm making a bioremediation resource that's a field guide for using different plants and mushrooms to take heavy metals out of our territory. And that's part of the futurity of if we want to have that land-based relationship as Indigenous peoples, then we have to heal some of the you know, the colonial scars on our territories. And that means having like places that are safe to drink water and to be able to recultivate our territories. And then another piece to this is also looking at it from an Indigenous sciences and Indigenous technologies perspective and building in a critique of Western scientific and technological progress through like AI and robotics, and that these are not neutral technologies. Like these are very steeped in necropolitics, and there's a lot of implication. And even what we've already seen to date around like AI, for example, like this is not our friend, you know, especially for colonized people. This is the metamorphosis of colonialism. This is the next stage of assimilation, and it's going to be enforced by robot dogs with guns. You know, like we think that systemic racism and through policing is bad now. Wait until there's not even a human being behind it, you know? So these are some of the things I think that we need to think about tactfully. And it's really a matter of a confrontation with the state. And this is where I get overwhelmed because when we look at globalization, I was invited to so-called Australia and I spent a bunch of time there with warriors of the Aboriginal resistance and a bunch of their Indigenous sovereignty movements, like their sovereign embassies, and like seeing what happened in, say, so-called Perth, Australia and Noongar territory in 70 years that took place, you know, in say Tiohtià:ke Mohawk territory over 600 years. Like the time collapse it's overwhelming. And then you have all these states, their technology sharing, their resource sharing, their intelligence sharing, like they're sharing their resources. So like to say that we can't take on the state is just, it's outdated and needs to be left behind. We need to be honest and we don't have time. We do not have time. Like we're looking at the reality of climate collapse or however you want to talk about it, catastrophe. And it's like, there's incredible, like we have displacement, like just even the ability to access water. Like it's like the sense of urgency should be off the roof, you know? Anyway, so try not to be depressed, guys.
No, it's great. It's great. And I want to interject here a question. Pretty much one of the questions why I organized this thing, and this is for all of you. And maybe this really, Kieran can answer this maybe better than others. I don't know. I think everyone will be able to have a good stake in this. But I just want to know, how come decolonial academics or radical academics are not actually talking about and relating ultimately the colonial structure and the state to university structures. And I just really feel like the state is being left out in academic decolonial thought, or at least mainstream academic decolonial thought. And I would really love to hear why, from everyone, why they think that is. Because for me, I'm perplexed by it. I've been perplexed by it for at least 10 years, going to graduate school and just seeing these words and how people talk about it and the different relationships behind it. And none of it ever made sense to me. So if someone could please help me on this panel, I'd love everyone to say something on this, is why academics aren't actually making this connection to the material arrangements of the university, how they're structured, and really why we're not actually making it. A lot of what people have said today is really pointing to the legal system and the state being fundamentally a colonial institution that must be addressed. Amanda, please get at it.
I'll just start it off and then I'll try to be succinct. And in my personal opinion, it's like, for example, so like, why are white folks like sometimes struggle with anti-racism? Because it's uncomfortable and it implicates you. And so that it's as simple as that. Funding, access to class mobility, like it's an ivory tower, you know, they don't call it an ivory tower for nothing. It is an institution of whiteness, or at least of like Western modernity, you could say. And it because they benefit. Like, very simple. That's my opinion.
Awesome, thanks. Anyone else?
There's so much. The word that keeps coming, couple of things. I'm just going to make a bunch of phrases, right? Relationships, because coloniality is a relationship. Capitalism is a relationship. Capitalism is social relationships. That's what it is. Relationships with each other and with other beings. And what Amanda is saying, and what part of decolonization, what decolonizing is about, is changing the relationships between nouns and verbs, between what kind of notions of sovereignty are you going to have? Is it going to be property-based? A relationship with land can be based on property or in other kinds of ways. So when one is talking about these things, it's across the board. State, of course, the state is everywhere. And you have to take on the state. And yet at the same time, capitalism, with a small c, it would be deeply interested in getting rid of the state. Right? So in some senses, it's a very contradictory relationship with all categories that we have. Why doesn't the university take on the state? I think radical academics do take on the states and do take on the university, but as somebody who now has to chair the department, and I don't want to, but this is how democracy plays a role in our academic structures, is that we all rotate. And part of the role of the chair, part of the role of all these so-called leaders, is that basically what you're going to do is to instrumentalize the university's policies. And the US university, like US people, usually don't think structurally. So all the kind of stuff that's happening in US universities and US academia is what's been going on across the world, right? All over, right? Neoliberalism didn't happen just in Argentina and Mexico and India. It happened across the world, including here. So what you're seeing right now in the universities, and again, every day I see this, we have to come up with our own budgets to pay for our staff. We have to come up with our own budgets to come up with computers. So how is our academics taking on the state? I mean, I would say no statement can be made as a blanket statement, because simultaneously something opposite is simultaneously happening. So here's a phrase I'm going to leave, because there's just so much to say and it's impossible to say it in any kind of a coherent way. And that is the issue of continuities and ruptures, right? It's sort of everything that we've been talking about has been going on for a very, very long time. It's not that the appropriation of knowledge is recent. Amanda is talking about the Haudenosaunee that is completely embedded in democratic structures in thought. And part of that is everything has been turned into a noun or proper noun, right? And the kind of stuff on decolonial thought, which is, it's turned into a proper noun. And again, here's the aporia, continuities and ruptures. You don't want to turn it into a proper noun, but there is continuity of a variety of different structures. and they get replicated. Look at decolonial, look at proper named decolonial thought. The continuity there is that there's a way in which feminist knowledge or feminist contributions are invisibilized constantly. You see that volume, the cultural studies volumes, and you can see the decolonial thought folks desperately trying to put in feminism that they can't find people to write. Africa gets completely invisibilized again and again and again, and there is continuities and ruptures. So every example that I can give will be talking about how continuities and ruptures exist and the contradictions exist. That every statement that I make about breaking something, I'm deeply implicated in continuing it, right? So there is no, like we all here deeply implicated, not necessarily in the same kind of way. I'll stop there.
Awesome, thank you.
If I can just jump in a bit there. No, I think, thank you very much, Kiran. That was quite interesting. I mean, going back to Sanders' question, I would say that I agree with the thing with like academia is that the neoliberal way that academia is managed, I think it's like it creates it embodies a problem into a particular department, person, process, right? So I think that is a way of like legitimizing how liberalism continues to operate. And I think that's the big problem with like liberalism, right? It's embedded into basically every structure. And I think if we really want to contest it, I think Abdullah Öcalan has written quite a lot about that. Öcalan, I don't know how you say it in English actually, but I think it's that ideology of liberalism is, I think, where it's quite pernicious and problematic, and I think we should contest it. I don't know, but I was listening to Kiran, and I'm not sure if the capitalism will be benefited by ridding itself of the state. I think in Latin America, what my perspective is that capitalism actually needs the state to be more violent and more destructive and more oppressive, right? Policing has increased a lot in Mexico. This is one of the most puzzling things now is like the leftist government has now militarized basically every aspect of social life more than the right wing before, so it's impressive. Like the amount of like how capitalism is advancing through the state, to me also sort of points this idea that we should not presume that decolonization should come through the state. And I think there is quite enough evidence for that now. But yeah, and that's also puzzling to me that some decolonial scholar people keep talking about, oh yes, the state, and congratulations to, let's celebrate Venezuela because U.S. imperialism. Is like, why are we again thinking that the state, even if it's like from the south or from the north, these are again Eurocentric ideas, right? So I think we should contest them, reject them, and if we've known that this recipe produces something that is rotting and horrible to eat, why are we still using the same ingredients of the same recipe to try to transform reality? This is puzzling to me, but it's there, and it's there in the colonial thought, and this is, I think, why post-development is so rich and useful and nice. I'm not saying it's perfect, of course, but Ivan Illich was saying this in 1970s. And we have, for some reason, not taking him into account, or we have just discounted his thought. so again, there's people who did do that and has written extensively, and I think that's also useful to take back here. And yeah, sorry, I have more to say, but yeah, just to bring that in there.
All right, Usman, before we open this up.
Yeah, well, something? Just a quick comment on this. Like, I think for me, the answer, like, why university is like, conservative in that sense, like we are not willing to do kind of, this take radical position, probably answer is in the history of like, how this whole, the mass education programs, how they came into being, and the whole idea of creating the institution, these kind of institution, or like, this whole, the programs for the education was to serve certain, the certain process, being the kind of producing the industrial workers and like producing and like supporting the capitalist system at the start, right? So I think that it's kind of inbuilt in the system in such way that like that university, just as like kind of if I was to say like the example that I was giving with the bureaucracy, right? That it's the part of the very much a sense of the whole thing that is like now in case of I would say like in case university as well, that like it's is the part of a sense of it, that, you know, that how the whole knowledge kind of industry is structured. And I mean, if we talk of, like, you know, the neoliberal industry, like neoliberal university, which is like much more recent trend, but like before that as well, right? It was not like universities were producing some radical kind of, you know, thoughts or like that kind of things, right? So I think it's like, for me, it's like the history that we can see, and then maybe from there we can kind of, you know, make sense like why maybe, you know, the universities are not really to that point, like, you know. But yeah, I don't have much to say on this anyways, but.
All right. So let's open this up for general questions and answers. So far, there's already one in here that I guess I'm imagining it's geared towards Amanda. It says from Fizza, thank you very much for the, I'm imagining it wants to say wonderful and quite thought-provoking talks. Just to nudge you, and I want to ask if indigenous cultures and societies are all uniform and without hierarchies. Asking this, I am not denouncing the importance of indigenous cultures, but rather how to understand this complexity.
Well, they're definitely not all uniform. I guess like the best way to start to understand is to start with the territories that you're on, and understanding the culture of the peoples whose territory you occupy, if you're a non-Indigenous person, or even if you're an Indigenous person on someone else's territory, like that place-based starting point. I would recommend starting from there. And that, like, but this is the thing, it's very interesting because although, and like, are we always horizontal? No. But also it's like, I can only speak to cultures that I'm familiar with. And a lot of the time, and then the other thing is that we have a network and we've been exposed to each other, and there are certain things that we do have in common. Like Indigenous peoples globally often like that familial relationship to the land. Pretty much we're gonna have that, you know. So there's certain, like there are certain qualities that we do share, but it can be very, and I also like sort of like to get away from this kind of even sort of pigeonholing into this idea of, is it hierarchical? Because that also for me is sort of like coming from a Western worldview, whereas in Indigenous worldviews often will discuss like roles and responsibilities and difference. And so for example, like within the Haudenosaunee context, like we have people who we recognize that they would be a good speaker to be able to represent the perspectives of the clans when we're having our meetings. And those people, they were perceived as being chiefs or whatever, but that's not really their job. Their job is to be the speaker. In a way, they don't have a personal opinion. The personal opinion comes out when we're all talking in a circle in the clan meeting, and that's when you can have your individual opinion. Like the idea of what do you guys call it in damn it, spokes council model. I don't know if you're familiar with that. That's our governance system. That's how we do it. And so anyways, and so there might, and also like, so for example, the Wet'suwet'en, one time when I was in their territory, they were telling a story about like basically the boundaries and different clans not being able to hunt in each other's territory. Is that hierarchical? Maybe, if you can only hunt in the territory that you're from. And that's part of, like, you could say land management. But it's also a role, and it has like a broader implication in terms of like being mindful of being able to you know, have like not overhunt and things like that, basically. So anyway, so is it hierarchical? I mean, I think it depends. I think that looking at things as if they're hierarchical is not necessarily, you know, because then you're sort of imposing a Western worldview. And like what I would say is that it's more based on specific roles and responsibilities, and those things can shift. And like, for example, like we have the role of elders in our communities. Pretty much, you could say potentially, you could say that's a universal thing for Indigenous peoples worldwide, that we have elders and knowledge keepers who know our ways and they pass that information on. But at the same time, we also recognize that children have contributions and they have minds and they're able to observe, and they're not so deep into our culture, and so they can see things that might be harder for adults to see. And so it's more of looking at how there's, you know, a different role for everyone. Anyways, so so cultural protocols and like things like that are very diverse. And like in Turtle Island, like, I don't know, over 800 sovereign nations, like we have distinct languages, and like we have political relationships, and we have sometimes ceremonial relationships and hold songs for each other and things like that. But we are extremely distinct. And so-called Australia, territory boundaries are very strict. And so it's very you could say it's very diverse, and it's multiple things at once. You know, it's multiple things at once. It's like plural, very plural. Yeah. Okay.
All right, Amanda, thanks for that. Looks like you're popular today. You got another question coming at you. Do you think it's appropriate for scientists at academic institutions to speak Indigenous collaboration / leadership? By Shannon Hankin.
I think there's a couple layers to that, but I would say yes, but it has to be reciprocal, and it shouldn't be tokenistic. And so what is how is it a meaningful collaboration? And what are the offers? What are you going to offer Indigenous nations and scholars and community members? Because a lot of the time, our scientists don't have PhDs. Like, you know, one of a knowledge keeper who I work with, she was recently given an honorary doctorate because of her work in the bush. And also it kind of ties back to someone in the chat was talking about how, you know, Western institutions of knowledge determine what knowledge is valuable, you know, and so that's exactly it. Like Indigenous ways of knowing and being are seen as backwards and all these types of things, when it's like now Western sciences are like really catching up, especially to Indigenous sciences and land management practices. Anyways, so yes, I would say like incorporate meaningfully Indigenous ways of doing and being, and collaborating with people, and also identifying what are the give backs to nations, to communities, and ensuring that it's not tokenistic, and also recognizing that there are like conflicts of interest. Like McGill University, like they do so much R&D for drone technology that polices Indigenous communities, or with also, and this is also to what you were talking about, Xander, it's like also people have contracts with the state, with like military contracts that are providing funding, like maybe less so in the humanities, but you know, and then there's also a scarcity of funding, and so people are afraid of like even having a department, and if they speak out, then okay, you guys are getting on the chopping block. So it really does also tie back to that, like almost the way that capitalism forces people into like, they have rent, they have a mortgage, they have like increased grocery bills, you know, and so it's like, I just need to like do what I can to survive. And like, not that that's an excuse, but this is where it's like, I think, where do we create community and solutions outside of those systems and support each other, mutual aid and stuff.
Awesome, thanks. All right, we've got one for everyone. I guess we'll kind of run this for the next 15 minutes. We got 15 more minutes of all this, even though I think it's worth extending. But all right, for everyone, from Juan, thank you all for a lovely panel. I would like to make a question for all speakers. Could you please elaborate on whether you equate extraction and extractivism, or whether you consider them different? And if different, does the difference matter theoretically and politically? So we're here at a little more academic distinctions. But does anyone make a stab at that? Not everyone has to answer this, but someone should.
I put something in the chat, but I want to pick it up again, because to clarify again, we haven't used this expression, but it's true. You can't talk about capitalism without colonialism. Capitalism is colonial capitalism from its get-go, right? It wasn't it didn't form in Europe and then get expanded. It was colonial capitalism, and it was based on extraction of lands, labor, value of different kinds. So the distinctions matter and in any writing, any thought, you just have to clarify them. And I want to put a pitch again for thinking about social reproduction writ large, right? All production is social reproduction because it's reproducing certain kinds of relationships. I'm going back to the issue of land. So extraction versus extractivism, yes, I think extractivism is used more specifically, I won't say narrowly, for mineral extraction, but it's true for all resources at large, right? But it's also the extraction of labor, of all kinds of labor. And again, you think of this, see this in COVID capitalism, how all of us, whose labor is being extracted for what way again and again and again. That's a kind of extraction too. So are they different? Yes. Are they related to a certain way of thinking? But then parsing out the relations of different kinds of that thinking. All that specificity matters. Yeah. I mean, what's fantastic, as somebody who's getting older and older, and somebody told me I wasn't supposed to say that I should not reveal my age, which is also interesting, right? It's a certain kind of way of thinking. Somebody said, oh, you said you're middle-aged 3 times in that panel. You shouldn't have said it. And it's like, well, why not? I am middle-aged. But where was I going with that? Well, this is the problem of being middle-aged. You forget where you were going with that. I just remembered. I think what I'm finding, quote, hopeful is that people are engaging with these issues. There's not answers. The same questions are coming up again and again and again. And instead of being really pissed about the fact that the same questions are coming up again and again, I think it's fascinating that people are engaging those questions, are discovering folks. And where I'm trying to really let go of Western capitalist ways of thinking is you learn in a variety of different ways. You're going to cite different people. You're going to approach and get to a place from a very, very, very different way. And so I'm trying to walk away from, okay, they haven't read this person. They haven't cited this person. They haven't read my work. They don't find this work useful. So in some ways, it's like a small way of letting go of the noun Kiran, and remember that Kiran is actually a verb in relationship with a bunch of a whole different other folks, which is really hard, right? Because it's like our egos are deeply, deeply, deeply involved in this. And when you remove your ego, of course, the university is perfectly happy to give the promotion and the money and the credentials and therefore the few resources of photocopying money to somebody else who is more productive. So again, conundrums and aporias, but yeah, I'll be quiet.
All right. Anyone else?
Yeah, just to kind of pick on what Kiran just said, like, changing nouns to verb, the thing that she said, actually, I think it's really beautiful in that context as well, and would help us to understand, the kind of this difference that Yuan is talking of. So for me, I would say, like, when we talk of like extractivism, that refers to actually this capitalist mode of accumulation, right? It's a way of accumulating capital, and it's like, as Barry would say, like, it's a way of thinking, how you relate with your land, with your place, with your territory, with the nature around you, right? So this is what kind of when we say extractivism, that's what it refers to, like, this mentality in which the idea is to extract without giving back, right? So it's not this, what Amanda was saying, like, this familial relationship. So it's not like just you taking, but there are reciprocity in that sense. Whereas for extractivism particularly, the reciprocity does not exist. So kind of a corollary result of that is to have depletion. So extraction, I would say, like, may and may not necessarily be, and end up in depletion. Whereas extractivism, one of the feature of extractivism as this phenomenon emerging like globally is depletion, and a mode of accumulating capital. Yeah.
Anyone else for the next question?
I will just jump really quickly with just a few comments. Yeah, just to say, yeah, I think it's a useful distinction to to separate extraction from extractivism. What I would say is we encourage, again, what Kiran was saying. We have to understand it as part of capitalism, right? It's constitutive of capitalism. So not to just dilute capitalism. Capitalism is the problem, right? And it's using colonialism, extractivism, patriarchy in its benefit, right? But the structure is capitalist modernity. So I think that we shouldn't lose track of that. But I think it's important to think about as a dominant mentality of how capitalism operates today, right? Of course, again, it has a 500-year-old history. Maybe more. We could discuss that, but that's maybe a very long discussion. But again, it's part of that capitalist structure, and I think that we shouldn't lose sight of that. Just to say that. And I was also thinking, like, when somebody asked about indigenous people, if they are all the same, or if they are all anti-state, decolonial by reference. No. This is something that we should acknowledge as well. But this also applies to the other side as well. Not because we are not indigenous, we are de facto agree with development, progress, and neoliberalism, capitalism, which is again also an essentialization. But this is just to say that this is why political affinity, I think, is so important. How do we build that solidarity with those struggles? How do we create our own place-based reality of justice, that ideas, and how then do we debate with each other and we learn from each other? I think that's why these ideas like the global tapestry of alternatives are so nice, because they are creating precisely that. They are recognizing how each place particularity. There's a very nice phrase where Gustavo Seba used to say, indigenous peoples have the tradition of changing traditionally, right? So, for example, if you look at how women were included into a very patriarchal society in Oaxaca, in Chiapas, in places like this, the Zapatista women have a wonderful leadership of they being the one who are now, talking for the people. But this took time. This took a process of integrating them, from rejecting the patriarchal structures, and from there creating a different, perception. So, but it was within their tradition, without losing who they are and how they operate and work. So yeah, just to say that I think those essentializations can be quite problematic at times. We sometimes do them without actually thinking a little bit what happens or how we reproduce it. But I think it's useful to think about that and to think how we engage with that. And I think militant research is, I think, that at least from academia, is sort of like really questions our relationship with this structure that is inherently extractive, problematic, liberal. So I think it's not to say that it solves the question, but it at least, I think, asks the right questions. And I'll just stop there.
All right, thanks. Yeah, I want to put a quick note in there, though, on this discussion on the university. Sometimes it's referred to as an ivory tower, and that's never really been my experience of the university. But again, it's almost discipline and country specific in terms of how that happens. I definitely equate the ivory tower more for US universities or even other European countries where there's often a very strong patriarchal model in place. I'm thinking parts of Southern Europe, but it's often very specific where it is, and it's often more in the natural sciences or in different areas. But even there, I don't even think it's fair to say. But obviously that ivory tower exists, but it's built on the backs of a lot of other researchers and people. And so I've never seen. Usually I kind of see it more as a modernist building built of messed up concrete that's kind of falling apart or has weird key cards and is more kind of a prison or a mental ward than an ivory tower. Even though that there's on top of that, there is an ivory tower somewhere, but I don't see it very often. But I'm not at Ivy League universities or things like this. And also, even producing and working your ass off pretty crazy in 100 different types of ways isn't necessarily going to secure you in any way, shape, or form in the academy. So from my perspective, the university is just another factory. It's another area of contestation. It's another bureaucracy and way to kind of tie you up to try to fight to have some type of resources and to really kind of break your life into a colonial system. And it's my personal perspective that there's not a greater kind of attribute of the colonial system than bureaucracy and these divisions of labor, which I think go straight to the core of civilizations and their development, especially, and I mean civilization in the negative and hierarchical sense of this. But moving on, Amanda, you are just so popular here today. Someone's asking, we got Deanna, they're asking for a little lesson. I think, maybe this could be skipped. I think if you're at school, and schools are often a failure for people, it's scary how the term terra nullius is not actually discussed more, but there's a question here. Amanda, thanks. Could you please expand one of the terms, terra nullius? Is this your term? Where could I read more about it? If you can just maybe just say quick or other places to read so we can maybe try to get to some of these. And some people have answered, but.
Yeah, I dropped it actually in the chat that it actually comes from some papal bulls in the 1400s. There's a few of them, but it's basically it's actually a legal structure that was perpetuated by the Vatican Church, by the Vatican and the Roman Catholic Empire, in order to justify. So this was their decree and declare that lands that were not occupied by Christians were empty. And so that was a justification for slavery, genocide, colonial expansionism, like all of it. So that's literally their legal structure for colonialism. And then I think Carlos put some references of some people who have some interesting things to say. So I would say, there you go. And also there's like, yeah, I'll just leave it at that.
Cool, thank you. Yeah, I'm sure the Wikipedia on terra nullius will be rather illuminating. Again, by Alice, incredible conversation. Thanks, everyone. I'm interested in the idea that extractivism began around 1492 and it isn't tied to the idea/relation of empire more generally. My history is not so hot. Does anyone have any thoughts on what might distinguish this period and its relations from the Roman Empire? So post-Columbus versus pre-Columbus. Does anyone want to jump on that?
This is the age-old discussion, right? When did capitalism begin? But is it a 5,000-year-old system or a 500-year-old system? You know, I myself, I have been, juggling because I think it's a bit difficult at times to sort of pin it down. My point would be, what changed in 1492? I think that is quite different. And there I admit I am really decolonial in that perception. So I think people who have read like Barry Gills and stuff like that would maybe disagree with me, or maybe Abdullah Ocalan also thinks it's a 500-year-old system. But here in Mexico, it's a very interesting discussion because, for example, just to give you a taste of it, there is a discussion between feminist decolonial scholars in Mexico who think that they have to make a distinction between patriarchal colonial exported from Europe and patriarchal before colonization. It's not the same thing, they say, because the colonization changed something, right? The structures of power changed. And they say it's not the same to be a patriarchal before colonization than after. And I don't know, it's an open discussion, but it sort of points again to this point, like where do we start to think about that? I would say that what changed in 1492 is that for the first time, there was a Eurocentrism that applied to everyone, and that didn't happen before. So it became like what Santiago Castro Gomez says is the hubris of 0 point, right? We have one culture that is above everybody else, and everything is below, right? So I think that is, one of the changes. And it's also the first time that capitalism becomes globalized, or it starts the process of globalization. So I think that's why I would argue that the point of difference from 1492 is substantial, and I would start to think about it from there, But yeah.
Yes, a contested topic, but a good one. And Barry Gillis would definitely say 5,000 years or more. But we're coming to an end here. We got 3 minutes. Does anyone want to say any final last words, or should we go through the panel? And does anyone want to give a shout out or a shutdown or anything like this?
I think we should give a shout out to all those people who've been giving us their attention, because that's really not a small thing to spend 2 hours or an hour of our time. So I want to say thank you to everyone who's here.
Yes, definitely. All right, anyone else? Is this how we concluded? I'm sorry, everyone, who we didn't get to some of your questions. Anyone else want to drop their hat for the final word?
I just wanted also to thank you, Thunder, for organizing, for putting everything together, for the invitation, to the wonderful people at EXALT for bearing again with me. And yeah, just to say thanks to all the panelists and people here. I think this was a very interesting and rich discussion.
All right, sounds good. Yes, thank you so much, EXALT, for trying to create and open these spaces. All right, is that going to conclude it? No one else wants to come in? Well, either way, thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Kieran, Usman, Amanda, Carlos, thank you so much. And again, as Kieran pointed out, thanks everyone who wasted their valuable life to sit in front of a computer and hear us jabber along. But hopefully it was engaging, entertaining, and you'll come back to the next EXALT dialogues, which will hopefully be about hydrological extractivism coming at the end of the year. So please, this will be released online probably in a week or so. And again, my utmost gratitude and humility for everyone who is here and who asked questions, and thank you so much. So with that, I bid you a good day.